You're on mid-cap, you're on little cap, whatever it might be, board, Sheryl, and you sort of think, well, you know, we know our shareholders, we're doing okay, we're all drawing a nice fee, you know, it's all quite comfortable. How do we get this issue onto the agenda? Because it strikes me that all boards need to be really thinking about, well, you know, what are their responsibilities, how is their engagement, how do we get this onto the agenda? Because amidst all the other things, it's quite hard to sort of say, we need to be thinking about how we might put out a fire or cope with difficulties if it occurred.
I mean, does anyone have some views around the table in terms of...
Any thoughts on that? I mean, you know, how do we get this on the agenda, I suppose, is really the question. Because, you know, you're having a nice time.
I've got a question that might help this, and I hope it's not too naive. But what are the drivers behind these activists? What are they looking for? What are they trying to achieve in creating a problem for the board? Is it financial, or is it ethical, or whatever else?
I think we can still say that the activist investor mandate is to unlock shareholder value, with a view to returning value to their own investors. So I guess in most circumstances the driver is still financial, but I guess a byproduct of that is making boards and management much more accountable and actually standing on guard. So what happens is that if an activist investor enters a register and it's found out, if you're a publicly listed company, you should actually be monitoring your register on a regular basis. Once again, the provisions in the Company Act allow you to go underneath the registered layer. If you see that there's an activist investor, what happens? Everyone just becomes much more aware and alert. So the directors, other shareholders, in fact, those who are afraid to vocalize their points of views are encouraged to do so. So ultimately, I think, to your point, Barry, maybe there's a lot more education and training of non-executive directors in general to be much more accountable and responsible to actually counter activism.
Just on the point that you raised, Barry, to get it into the boardroom discussion, you have to have peer benchmarking of performance, so as to actually assess whether the company of which you're a custodian actually is performing well against its competitors. So if so, you've got a story to tell. And if you're not, you clearly, if that underperformance persists, there's not only an activist shareholder coming in, but you might be disenfranchising your existing shareholders such that they convert to become activists. I think that's Cheryl's point.
With the Elliott's example, that was obviously very focused on NEDs.
Can everyone hear quite clearly? Yeah.
It was very focused on NEDs and changing the NEDs that were currently in post and bringing new NED blood into the process. Is that a new tactic, or is it a tactic that's been used by many other organisations?
You're a very perceptive man. So I think what's happened in the last 2-3 years with all this talk of shareholder activism is that, in fact, shareholder activism had declined between 2012 and 2014. So what happened was all these American activist investors decided to come to the UK and apply exactly the same tactics and strategies that worked in the US to the UK. No, that doesn't work. So why Elliott, in our opinion, worked very well was they took a much more conciliatory, measured, and gentlemanly approach instead of doing a Nat Rothschild and requisitioning a shareholder to remove 12 of the 14 directors. They took this approach of, okay, we're going to try by adding to the existing roster to hold management much more accountable. So I think, Louis, will see much more of this kind of UK UK-based, UK style of shareholder activism, just remember, we have an opportunity here. Shareholder activism in this country is evolving. It's not UK style or Canadian style. It's UK. So definitely it was quite a novel approach, and it was picked up all over the press. And
So,
Thank you. Stand up, hopefully everybody can hear me all right. First of all, thanks a lot. That's very enlightening, and I think we're moving towards a much more transparent world, where a lot of corporations are going to be transparent. Like the financial sector as an example, there's going to be a lot of consumerism sort of driving transparency. My question is, looking at this these type of investors you're talking about, what would you say from a non-executive director perspective? Is there any really major difference when it comes to these type of events compared with any other type of media crisis as an NED that you as a board need to be prepared? And I'm talking about, excuse me, I'm talking about sort of mid-cap rather than the large like BP, which would have a huge mechanism that would manage basically any crisis, for better or worse, as we've seen. But what's your sort of general advice? Is there really a difference in crisis management from an NED perspective? I think that's what my question comes down to.
that's a very good
Thank you.
question. Thank you. Ultimately, shareholder activism crisis is different and specific. So in this kind of situation, you're looking at, okay, what is the argument being posed by the activists? Does it stack up? What does our shareholder base look like? A lot of the times companies are still very underprepared. They only know their top 10 investors. In an activist situation, you best believe it that the activist is going to be drilling down and basically speaking to as many institutional and as many shareholders as possible. And then there's also the legal mechanics of the legalities of requisitioning a meeting. So what do you do? This requisitionist is requesting the share register. Am I allowed to just hand that over? So there's actually a lot of specifics involved when it comes to an activist situation. And basically we could spend like a whole week probably just going through what one would go through in a proxy fight. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't know until you have gone through it. And that's why, again, at Boudicca, we are promoting this kind of simulating a proxy fight, so that if a non-exec director, if a director actually goes through a proxy fight, they're ready. So one of the situations we worked on is this transport company, which had identified an American activist investor on their register. Basically, their advisors, led by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, gathered all of us advisors and basically got us to create a one-pager, a plan of attack that the company would keep in the safe and basically unlock should a requisition actually arrive. So that's the level of preparedness that companies need nowadays to be able to effectively handle this and not have a proxy fight dominate their lives for 2 months.
so.
How far down the food chain do you find activists operating? I mean, FTSE 100 certainly, but how far down the market cap scale have you seen them in action?
Very good question. In fact, you can see activists throughout all company sizes. So we work with all sizes of companies, so ranging from the likes of Xstrata to a 10 million pound market cap total company. What we found in the UK is actually you have a greater chance of success with the small caps. And the reason for that is because of the composition of the shareholder base. If 30% of your issued share capital is held by institutional investors who actually vote, and the balance is held by retail investors and private client brokers that don't vote. Your 25% has a much stronger weight. So, shareholder activism, no company is, all companies can be affected. There's no vaccine and there's no immunity.
So,
The way the discussion was just now sounded like that immediately there was a shareholder activist, it was a crisis, which I can see from a management point of view, but should that be the NED perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. So, I mean, I'm mostly covering a proxy fight situation where an activist investor has been agitated so much that they actually requisition a shareholder meeting. A proxy fight is just a final result, a final resort. So before you even get to that stage, there's so many levels to go through. So if you identify an activist investor on your register, the first thing you should do is pick up the phone, find out what that activist issue is, and maybe find a middle ground. And that's where non-executive directors actually can have an important say. I'll give you an example. So one of these engineering, working for a small cap engineering firm, I got a phone call from the senior independent director because he had identified that the founder was thinking of requisitioning a meeting. He would never have picked up the phone to me unless he had actually gone through the same situation at another engineering firm where he was the finance director. But because he was informed and had gone through that experience, he knew that he didn't want this to lead to a proxy fight and that he should get advice on how to keep the situation contained. So NEDs can provide amazing advice and difference in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, please.
I was just coming on a more positive note, because activism is all, as you said, a position of last resort. In terms of shareholder relationships, the broader level, including the activists, do you have any thoughts on, for people who are on NEDs in companies, on how they can build and have strong shareholder relationships so you minimise the chances of activism, shareholders gaining ground?
No, absolutely, great question. So the UK is actually not that bad in terms of shareholder engagement compared to the US and Canada because we have the stewardship code. What all companies need to apply is actually an ongoing analysis and identification of their shareholders. So not just the top layer, not just the registered holder, but actually drilling down to find out who the fund managers are and the beneficial holders are. And then on an ongoing basis, go to see these institutional investors, and not just the portfolio managers, which your investor relations teams will cover, but also the nerds in the back office, the corporate governance people, who more and more are now responsible of actually ticking the boxes. So at Boudicca, we have a dedicated team of corporate governance analysts who come from the likes of PERC, Manifest, and even ISS. Basically, their job is to help us and our clients understand how these institutional investors go about making those decisions, so that before we send our clients to see them, they already have an idea of the thought process of these institutions. So basically, understanding the shareholder base, and then going to speak and having a relationship with these investors will make things easier. And if you find that actually, you're a non-exec in a small cap company, a small cap shareholder composition is very different from a Glencore or a BP or a Shell. You will find that many of your shareholders are actually within inactive, budget private client brokers. So if you find that 70% of your shareholder base is within these private client brokers, find out through Section 793 of the Companies Act who they are, and have an evening where you have let's say, beers together and get them on side.
Oh, I think there's another question on this table, was there? Oh, sorry, forget. Oh, Robert.
I was going to ask Sheryl,
Yes, Robert.
a Lands Trust, a very good example of what we've just been saying. Back about 4 or 5 years ago, Laxey had a go at it. That was an entirely selfish discount stripping exercise by Laxey. What Elliott are doing as a cap is actually doing something with a benefit for all shareholders, which is a much softer, less aggressive approach. But when you get down to the bottom of it, all these actions are caused by underperformance of the business and share price and overpayment of the executive.
Yeah.
And a lot of these fights basically get down to the executive in job protection mode. And the amount of money that is spent, with greatest respect, on advisors, in the case of Alliance Trust, £3 million on a job protection mode, is absolutely disgraceful, frankly. Nobody ever says that. And the non-exec should be saying, we can't be spending that money just so Catherine Watson can keep her job for another year and a half. That's outrageous. She should
Right,
be...
we could buy 2 or 3 new chief executives. For that.
Exactly. So it's the non-execs who've got to sort of be able to say to the board and the chairman, this has got to be proportionate. And clearly that didn't happen to Alliance Trust. And they've been through it before.
Yeah.
So, you know, it doesn't say much for the non-execs, in my humble opinion. Yeah. I mean, I was involved in this some years ago in a small cap, basically changing strategy. If you want to change a company strategy to make it better, you've always got to change the board because they're all wedded to the old strategy. So we were involved in doing this. The company spent 300,000 on their job protection exercise. We spent 5. That's the nonsense. We were pretty upset actually by the brokers who took 2 years' fees and resigned. And the new chairman obviously referred to it in his next chairman's statement, and you know made it pretty clear he was pretty unhappy with the price and the behaviour of the advisors of the previous regime. So, you know, these are things that people have to look at, and non-execs in particular. If you're doing a good job, the non-execs should be saying, if we're not careful, there's going to be an activist on our tail. And we've got to take appropriate action to avoid that situation. The way to do it is good governance and good performance. And I agree, keep in touch with the shareholders. Directly, in my view, the chairman should speak directly to the shareholders. So there's no censoring by executives, by stockbrokers, or by all that stuff. We must get it from the horse's mouth.
Indeed.
Because I've seen a number of cases when the board have been shocked by the views of the executives of institutional shareholders. They had no idea what was coming down the line. So communication, direct communication is something.
Cheryl, just if I may just intersect a point on that. Would I be right in thinking that in most public companies, the principal contact between the board and the fund managers tends to be the CEO and the FD? They're the ones that go through and present the slides and whatever. And often, you say, the non-executives can be completely oblivious to the quality of that relationship. Is that something you've discovered?
Generally, I would say, you're right. In an activist situation, I mean, Alliance Trust, there is so many things to take away, and I agree with your points. In that situation, it was actually the CEO who was doing a lot of the investor showcasing, when in fact it should be the chairman, or she calls herself the chair, or the senior independent director. So the Alliance Trust case is a very specific situation. There are things that happen. You flagged the £3 million, Robert. That is massive, and that excludes all the expenses that Elliott had to pay as well. So when the requisition dropped at Alliance Trust, I think what happened was that instead of the chairwoman or the chair or the chairman, whatever she's called, picking up the phone to Elliott, she probably called the bankers and the lawyers first. And basically they took a very aggressive approach. It was probably one of my top 6 most difficult situations ever worked on. And then it was a massive emotional roller coaster to the shareholders as well. Just remember, 70% of that company's issued share capital are retail investors, mostly septuagenarians, octogenarians, maybe even older. And their families have held those shares for 50 years. And basically, on day one, you're telling them, don't vote, don't support these resolutions. It's impossible that these non-executive director nominees are independent. And then the day before the shareholder meeting, telling these same shareholders via RNS announcement, which these septuagenarians and octogenarians don't read, that in fact, we are now inviting these 2 directors, 2 of the 3, to sit on our board. So you've spent £3 million. You put your shareholders through an emotional roller coaster. You took a very aggressive approach that clearly didn't work, because otherwise you wouldn't have shaken hands with who you viewed the enemy. And then the day of the shareholder meeting, you have all these shareholders who are willing to die in a ditch for you and angry at you. So in our opinion, that's probably not the ideal way.
Can I just ask you, Sheryl, what was it? I mean, obviously they came in because they knew, the board knew what the vote, because they got a 48-hour notice, don't they? What was the vote? Did they win it or did they lose it?
Oh, I wish they knew. So that information was not publicly available. We can only speculate. You know, I think we would have won, but that's just, but it's unconfirmed.
So,
thanks for your introduction, Sheryl. Of course, very interesting. I'd just like to ask 2 questions. One is in relation to, if you take the Alliance Trust situation. Now they've got 2 directors on the board from Elliott. Do you know how that's changed the dynamics and how the board works? I don't know if you can share any insights of that. And the second question I was going to ask you was, if somebody came to you and asked you to act for them, how do you kind of decide whether they've got a case whether they're a prospective client, or do you just take their money and run?
Well, to your first point, so the directors that were newly appointed to the board are independent of Elliott, so there is no relationship between the 2. So to be honest with you, I'm not sure of what the situation is at the moment. I think there was recent information in the press that Elliott has increased their stake in the company. But part of the truth is that they are to be at peace with one another until at least after the next AGM. So I guess we will find out at the next AGM. And then in terms of who we work with at Boudicca, I would say about 60–70% of the time we work with publicly listed companies. And then the rest of the time we work with activists, investors. And then in terms of determining on whether or not we should work with someone, well, you know, we're a young company, we're aggressive, and we are entrepreneurs. Obviously, we do our conflict check.
Sure.
And then if conflict is clear, that's fine, we'll work with them. If it's an activist investor, and you know, we are not familiar with their track record, obviously we will do our due diligence to see, okay, is it worth spending time with these people? We have worked with, you know, lesser known activists where we actually spent a lot of time providing them advice, but it was like bringing a horse to the water, but not being able to make the horse drink.
okay, I'm going to take this as one final question for Sheryl, if I may. Yeah, thank you.
So this sounds to me like it's very similar to family-owned business, where you have a couple of kids that sort of have similar shareholding positions. Is that something you have seen?
Yeah, I would say probably some you know, like a larger scale to that. So maybe a family of 10 brothers and sisters, and then basically one brother going rogue and saying, I want to change this company, and basically I'm going to enforce some changes, and then others are opposing it. But you know, his ultimate goal is to unlock value.
Terrific. Sheryl, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to, if I may now, I think that's terrific, and you've got a good sense of questions. Sheryl's going to be here and around in the bar, so hopefully you'll have a chance to sort of have some one or two one-to-one conversations with her. Now, I'm going to in a moment just ask Duncan to propose a vote of thanks, but just before I do that, I'm just going to ask Jason. Jason, just a quick word from you.
Oh no,
For us at GMS,
tonight's been fantastic as always. I hope everyone agrees. We always bring very interesting speakers, so thank you, Sheryl. And no, short and sweet from me. Really to thank you, Barry, for chairing another great evening. So thank you very much. And Duncan's the star of the show, though. He's going to do the closing.
He is indeed. Thanks, Jason.
Moore Stevens and Russam GMS take great pleasure in working with NEDgroup to identify topics that are relevant in the boardroom. And we search high and low for quality speakers and quality topics, marshalled by the skillful chairmanship of Barry Gamble that we've seen on display tonight. And I think we've had a real feast tonight. As a measure of that feast, I'll ask you two questions. First, in the last 5 years, who in this room as a director has encountered an activist shareholder in their company? Hands up, please. A few of you. Okay, I'll ask the question in a slightly different way. Tomorrow, when you get back to your offices, who in this room is going to be looking at their shareholder register? Hands up. I think by the reaction in the room, I'll take that'll be the majority. And I think that's the quality of the speaker that we've had on display tonight. Sheryl, you've covered your subject with great mastery. We thank you for the frankness with which you've spoken this evening, and indeed the accuracy with which you responded to the questions from the guests here tonight. May I invite you all, please, to thank Sheryl and Boudicca, Proxy consultants, for their time and the subject matter they've covered this evening. Thank you.